Charles Leclerc has cracked under pressure as an unforced error meant he ended up in the barriers and giving Verstappen a huge lead in the championship. Meanwhile, in a weekend where Mercedes looked to be further back than usual, they seized the opportunity to achieve their best result of the season so far with a hard-fought double podium. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the French Grand Prix. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. Leclerc cracking under pressure. Charles Leclerc is in his first realistic championship battle this year, and certainly on a Saturday he's driving in a way that shows he's in this fight. But a combination of bad reliability, bad strategy and simple errors means that he's not really in competition anymore. On this occasion, after a difficult win with reliability concerns in Austria, Leclerc simply lost the rear end after the back straight, which sent him into an uncontrollable spin and off into the barrier. Following this, he couldn't reverse out, meaning he'd cost himself a strong result once again. At the time, he was looking good in the race. He'd kept the lead at the start, was running well in the first stint, and even looked like he was managing his tyres better than the Red Bull of Max Verstappen behind him. But he simply pushed too much, and meant that the 38-point deficit to Verstappen that could have been reduced had he held on to the lead ended up being extended to 63 points, a huge mountain for the Monegasque driver to climb. It's crazy to think that after just 3 races this year, Leclerc was leading Verstappen by 46 points, and that has swung back in the Dutchman's favour by more than 100 points since that stage. For me, I think this is a sign of Leclerc's inexperience in championship fights. Last year, Verstappen seemed to take to fighting for a championship with ease relative to the Ferrari driver this year. At the end of the day, the fight we saw in 2021 was between 2 drivers that very rarely made mistakes, and small moments decided the title. But this year, Leclerc seems to be showing his fragility, and he knows it. Following his retirement, he gave a brutally honest interview saying that he's driving well, but these kinds of mistakes are simply unacceptable. For that then, it's got to be a red box for Leclerc, who will understandably be disappointed. With 10 rounds to go, it's a huge hill for him to climb, and not all of that is his fault, but he hasn't helped himself on this occasion. Verstappen's simple victory. With Ferrari winning the last 2 rounds, I was surprised at how calm Verstappen was coming into this weekend. I suppose that's one of the perks of having such a huge championship lead beyond the midway point of the season. Plus, he'll be applying many of the lessons he learned from last year, highlighting the fact that every point counts and that even second place is acceptable when you have a large lead in the title. Not only this, but he knows that there'll be races later on in the year where the Red Bull car is stronger, and to be honest, once Leclerc made that error, it was so comfortable for Verstappen. He held a comfortable lead even after the safety car pit stops for the Mercedes cars and eased off into the distance. It was good to see from Verstappen and reinforced the reason why he's the number 1 driver at Red Bull, given the Mercedes drivers were faster than the other Red Bull of Sergio Perez. But more on those drivers later. I think for me, Verstappen is proving his worth in 2022. He showed that he was capable of winning the championship last year, and he's using that experience to look so comfortable this season. It's impressive from him, but also from Red Bull, with the team delivering a car that should be capable of winning the Drivers' Championship for 2 years in a row, through 2 completely different eras of Formula 1. So it's of course got to be a green box for Verstappen for an excellent victory in France. Before we take a look at Mercedes next, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. According to my analytics, 70% of you watching aren't yet subscribed, so please do hit that button. Thanks. Mercedes seized the opportunity. Mercedes have achieved their first double podium of the season, and they looked really strong in race trim this afternoon. The team didn't have the best qualifying, with Hamilton taking 4th and being in the best of the rest spot considering Sainz's penalty, and then Russell actually ended up behind Lando Norris in the McLaren, who had an excellent qualifying session himself. But in the race, Mercedes looked much better. Coming into the weekend, many believed that the circuit could suit the Mercedes, with the flat surface meaning there would likely be little to no porpoising. But nowadays, in the post-porpoising world, the Mercedes drivers looked like they were struggling in free practice. The drivers were about a second off the pace, and they were much closer to the midfield runners than the top 2 teams. But the points are handed out on Sunday, and that's exactly when Russell and Hamilton delivered. Hamilton got past Perez off the line and was then able to keep the Red Bull behind him, to the point where the Mexican driver had to drop back from the Mercedes to preserve his tyre life, given at the time the 2-stop strategy was potentially a realistic option. This was really impressive from Hamilton. He'd experimented with a different, higher downforce rear wing in FP3 compared to Russell, but clearly had the right setup for Sunday and achieved the team's best finishing position of 2022 so far. Meanwhile, George Russell did a good job to keep himself in a position where he was in the fight for a podium. Before the race, he claimed it was possible, but it always felt unrealistic without trouble for at least one of the top three drivers ahead of him. Despite dropping behind Alonso at the start, he did well and benefited from a cheap pit stop during the safety car and managed to be right in the mix for the podium positions. It was at the virtual safety car restart late on in the race though that Russell showed his opportunistic approach as he made sure to pay attention to when the VSC was ending. He caught Sergio Perez napping as he got the jump on the Red Bull driver and managed to get past the Red Bull within just a few meters on the restart. It was a great result after a tough battle with Perez, which even saw the two drivers come together at the chicane earlier on. So overall, it was Mercedes that delivered a brilliant result, and their reliability continues to be bulletproof as they managed to get that double podium. They've certainly seized the opportunity whenever it's presented itself to them this season, so for me, it's got to be a green box. A win could well be on the horizon if they keep this up. Alpine proving their pace. There's a new team in 4th position in the Constructors' Championship standings as Alpine did well at their home race to beat the McLarens. It began with an awesome start from Fernando Alonso as he went from 9th on the grid to 5th, overtaking so many cars in the process. It's yet more proof that if he doesn't have bad luck, he's certainly capable of racing alongside the rest of the drivers on this grid. Sure, he dropped back to 6th in the end, but realistically that was the best result he could have hoped for given it was just the drivers for teams in the top 3 that beat him on this occasion. Meanwhile, Esteban Ocon did well to gain 2 positions from his 10th on the grid with 8th at the finish, despite the clash with Yuki Tsunoda early on resulting in a 5-second penalty for the driver at his home race. This result gave the team 12 points to McLaren's 8, and it looks like there could well be a very close battle between these teams for the rest of the 2022 season. Definitely one to stay tuned for in the second half, but for Alpine, it's got to be a green box as this is exactly the kind of result that they need. FIA Inconsistencies once again. I'm starting to feel like a broken record raising the points of FIA inconsistencies once again in one of these videos, but the FIA have outdone themselves this weekend with their track limits enforcement. Coming into the weekend, the drivers raised a point regarding leniency on track limits violations following the 43 recorded at the Austrian Grand Prix. It was expected to be a point of contention once again in France as the circuit is surrounded by tarmac runoff areas, which lend themselves to corner cutting and extending. But the FIA stood firm, remaining in the position that the drivers would need to stay inside the white lines or risk having their lap time deleted. For me, as I've said before, this is the right way to go. If all 4 tyres are outside the circuit, then they should have their time deleted. However, where the FIA went wrong was only deciding to start enforcing track limits in qualifying. Mick Schumacher was an early victim of this. The Haas driver cut the corner at turn 3 on his final qualifying run, something that he claimed he'd been doing all weekend, without times being deleted. His time was enough to comfortably get him through into Q2, but instead he ended up out and stuck in 19th, which did become 17th following the grid drops for drivers further up the order. It was a really fine margin on this occasion, but the track limits enforcement in this new era tends to err on the side of penalise. I can see the German driver's point of view. If he's taken the same approach all weekend only to be penalised when it counted the most, it's not exactly fair or consistent. Following this, the driver told the media that he planned on going back to the FIA to discuss a better long-term solution to the issue. And I actually made a video on this topic since the last race, so I'll make sure to link that video at the end of this one so you can find out more about how to solve this problem. In the race itself, there were 10 times deleted, building on just 3 laps deleted in qualifying, with just Lando Norris and Sergio Perez being the repeat offenders in the race. However, it wasn't so much of an issue as it was in Austria, so it remains a question of their consistency from practice through to qualifying. For me, it's an amber box for the FIA as there's clearly still doubts over their decision making. Honourable Mentions. The first honourable mention today needs to go to Carlos Sainz. The driver did well to recover from 19th on the grid to get to 5th. There is of course a question over whether he could have managed it to the end on the medium tyres, and I wonder if that VSC could have saved him and perhaps avoiding that 5-second penalty for the unsafe release could have helped him as well. But hindsight is 2020, and actually Sainz had a strong weekend. His pace in qualifying was impressive, and without that engine penalty, he could well have been in with a shout of the win on this occasion. I think Aston Martin also deserves a mention for 10th and 11th, as they seem to get their strategy right and move up the order in this race. 1 point for this team though is still disappointing, and this shows how much further back they are compared to a couple of years ago. So it was a pivotal race in this championship, and it now looks like Leclerc and Ferrari may need a miracle in these final 10 races to claw back this gap. Make sure you take a look at this video next, where I explore the FIA war with the drivers over track limits.